나를 죄인으로 만드네. 나의 땅 나의 집 꽃이 된 사람 꽃이 된 사람 사랑하다가 나도 꽃이 되었네.
Gyeongju, a city that holds 1,000 years of history. The cherished values preserved over time have shaped who we are today. Now, through new encounters, we step into a better future. Sustainability, innovation. With the spirit of connection, a new millennium story begins. As APEC and Gyeongju come together. APEC meets Gyeongju.
In our headlines on this Wednesday, November 19th, here in South Korea. South Korea and the UAE pen a series of agreements to promote partnership across artificial intelligence, aerospace, nuclear energy, defense and culture during a summit between their leaders in Abu Dhabi. Also in Abu Dhabi, the Korea Electric Power Corporation and the Emirates Nuclear Energy Corporation commit to cooperation in advanced nuclear technologies driven by artificial intelligence. Meanwhile, an international arbitration body for investor-state dispute settlement rules in favor of South Korea over its dispute with private equity fund Lone Star, ending a legal battle that began 13 years ago. President Lee Jae-myung and his UAE counterpart Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan have drafted a joint declaration that details a strategic partnership in critical technology as well as in culture. Our presidential office correspondent Yoon Jung-min files this report from Abu Dhabi.
Pomp and circumstance were evident at the UAE presidential palace, with the summit beginning with an air show, a 21-gun salute, and a traditional performance. A sentiment of cooperation was shared between Presidents Lee Jae-myung and Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan.
확고한 신뢰와 상호 존중 그리고 형제의 정신을 기반으로 앞으로 어떤 외부의 상황 변화가 있더라도 결코 흔들리거나 후퇴하지 않도록 더욱 견고하게 발전시켜 나가기를 바랍니다.
The special strategic partnership between Korea and the UAE has been bearing fruit in many areas. The economy, energy, high technology, culture and defense are only to start with.
7 MOUs were signed following the hour-long talks, with a focus on AI, nuclear technology, and the space industry. The leaders also announced a joint statement reflecting the UAE's roadmap to become a world-leading nation by its centennial anniversary in 2071, and South Korea's role as its key partner along the way. South Korea also plans to take part in the UAE's Stargate project to build a large-scale AI data center based on their energy mix strategies. The two countries will also expand cooperation on the semiconductor supply chain. On defense technology, bilateral cooperation will be expanded to joint development, technology cooperation, and local production.
This cooperative model will help increase the possibility of our exporters securing orders in the defense industry worth over $15 billion.
Discussions also included building a K-city in the UAE, as well as cooperation on culture, education, and people-to-people exchanges.
Having wrapped up his state visit to the UAE, President Yi's next stop is Egypt for an official visit, where he will be sitting down with the Egyptian president and will lay out his Middle East vision during a speech at a university. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News, Abu Dhabi.
Now, as mentioned in that report, within the ambitious agenda between South Korea and the UAE is cooperation in AI-driven nuclear technologies to jointly enter third country nuclear energy markets. Our economic correspondent Moon Ji-young has details.
South Korea and the United Arab Emirates are expanding their cooperation in the nuclear sector, not just at home, but with an eye toward global markets. Following Tuesday's summit, the two countries signed a series of agreements aimed at bringing next-generation AI-powered nuclear technologies to project in third countries. According to the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Resources, the two sides exchanged memorandums of understanding covering nuclear cooperation as well as broader trade. A key agreement was signed between the Korea Electric Power Corporation and the UAE's Emirates Nuclear Energy Corporation. The two sides committed to strengthening collaboration on advanced nuclear technologies, including artificial intelligence, operational simulation systems, and the digitalization of power plant data. By integrating these digital and AI tools, the two companies aim to enhance the safety and efficiency of nuclear operations. They also plan to take the successful Baraka nuclear power plant model and expand it as a joint export package to third country markets. Baraka is the first Korean-built nuclear plant operating overseas.
These MOUs marks a shift from simple export to joint development, joint production, and even co-entry into global market. So in nuclear energy, the Baraka nuclear power plant has already become a major successful story, and now both sides want to expand into small modular reactor SMRs or nuclear AI and joint bid a global market.
In addition to nuclear cooperation, Seoul and Abu Dhabi also broadened their economic partnership. Seoul's Trade Ministry and Abu Dhabi's Foreign Trade Ministry signed an MOU regarding the administration of the Korea-UAE Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. Once it takes effect, an economic cooperation committee will be launched immediately to identify high-demand areas for bilateral cooperation and to streamline the implementation of the agreement. Moon Ji-young, Arirang News.
Also on Tuesday, President Lee Jae-myung attended a cultural performance at the Presidential Palace in Abu Dhabi following his summit with his UAE counterpart Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. The performance took place in the Spirit of Collaboration Hall and featured Korean traditional music and K-pop, as well as the UAE's traditional Al Ayala dance, a UNESCO-listed intangible cultural heritage. The show included some 300 guests. An international arbitration body for investor-state dispute settlement has ruled in favor of South Korea over its dispute with private equity fund Lone Star, ending a battle that began 13 years ago. Our An Sung-jin walks us through the legal saga.
The South Korean government has won a dispute against the foreign private equity fund Lone Star. The dispute had been going on for more than a decade. According to the International Center for a Settlement of Investment Disputes in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday, its committee ruled in favor of the South Korean government by deciding to cancel a ruling from 3 years ago, which had originally ordered the government to pay roughly $210 million to Lone Star.
This is a major achievement that protected national finances and taxpayer money, as it recognizes South Korea's sovereignty over financial supervision. This is the result of proactive litigation and responses from relevant government ministries, led by the Justice Ministry.
The lawsuit goes back more than 13 years when private equity fund Lone Star filed a $4.6 billion compensation claim against the Korean government in 2012. Lone Star had purchased Korea Exchange Bank in 2003 for 1.3 trillion Korean won and sold it 9 years later, making a profit of more than 4 trillion won. Despite the profit, the fund filed an international lawsuit claiming that the government interference prevented it from selling at a higher price. In 2022, the International Center for a Settlement of Investment Disputes ruled that South Korea pay compensation of 4.6%, what Lone Star had sought, to which both sides requested an annulment. The presidential office on Tuesday welcomed the victory in the lawsuit and added that the ruling corrects the error in the previous arbitration ruling, which held the government liable for compensation. The government also announced that the committee ordered Lone Star to reimburse 7.3 billion won, roughly $5 million, in legal costs incurred during the annulment process within 30 days. With this, the nearly 20-year saga with Lone Star has come to an end. An Sung-jin, Arirang News.
In other news, NVIDIA is poised to make public its latest earnings report, and analysts are keeping their eyes on the impact of that report on global stock markets. Our correspondent Park Chun-han explains.
Global investors are eyeing the U.S. market because NVIDIA, both the world's largest and most highly valued chipmaker, is set to report quarterly earnings after the session ends on Wednesday. According to Reuters, the options for NVIDIA's stock indicate that today's earnings could move its price either up or down by 7%. This percentage swing could affect the company's value by $320 billion, as the company's market cap is now trading at $4.41 trillion, or 6,474 trillion Korean won. NVIDIA currently accounts for 8% of the S&P 500, where the United States' 500 most valuable companies are combined on one index. This dominance extends far beyond the U.S. market, as the company sits at the core of the AI ecosystem, accounting for over 90% of high-performance GPUs, crucial in building the global AI infrastructure. A sales trader interviewed by Reuters said that while the stock itself could move up or down by 7%, the narrative impact could extend across $10 trillion worth of correlated trades. Furthermore, NVIDIA's influence reaches deep into South Korea's tech titans, such as Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix, which are key partners supplying critical DRAM and high-bandwidth memory for its chips. Meanwhile, the past few weeks have seen strong sell-offs by investors who doubt AI's potential and question whether the massive capital spending on AI infrastructure will ever yield matching profits. As a result, NVIDIA lost its status as a $5 trillion company, with its shares now trading more than 14% below their peak. Park Chun-han, Arirang News.
South Korea's top diplomat to the U.S. says Seoul will work closely with Washington to cultivate the conditions necessary for dialogue with North Korea. Addressing members of the South Korean media in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday, Ambassador Kang Kyung-hwa spoke of efforts to garner U.S. support for broader North Korea policy. She also reaffirmed President Lee Jae-myung's intentions for South Korea to serve as a pacemaker as the U.S. takes on the role of peacemaker to resolve tensions on the Korean peninsula. Kang also conveyed confidence in South Korea's plan for nuclear-powered submarines, reiterating the support from the Trump administration. Meanwhile, the diplomatic dispute between China and Japan over the latter's remarks in support of Taiwan have led to travel warnings and movie postponements. Our Lee Seung-jae has the latest.
Tensions between China and Japan are rising sharply, with Beijing rolling out a wave of retaliatory measures following Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi's recent remarks suggesting that military action by China against Taiwan could justify a response from Tokyo. The fallout has now escalated into what many Chinese commentators are calling a Japan restriction order, a series of coordinated steps aimed at squeezing Japan across multiple sectors. The latest measure comes in the form of travel to Japan. China's foreign ministry issued a travel alert advising its citizens to exercise caution when visiting Japan. Major airlines, including Air China, China Eastern Airlines, and China Southern Airlines, immediately began offering free cancellations for Japan-bound flights. Within just a few days, some 491,000 tickets to Japan were canceled by Chinese travelers. China's Ministry of Education also warned that public safety conditions in Japan had deteriorated and that crimes targeting Chinese nationals were on the rise, urging students to reconsider plans to study there. Reports also emerged that the release of upcoming Japanese films in China would be suspended. Titles affected include popular animated franchises like Crayon Shin-chan and Cells at Work. Analysts say the pattern is clear. China is strategically selecting areas where its large domestic market gives it leverage and where Japan's economic ties to China are most sensitive. With state media warning that further countermeasures and even suspension of bilateral exchanges remain on the table, concerns are mounting that this standoff could harden into a prolonged diplomatic confrontation. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Also on the international front, Israel launched an air raid against a Palestinian refugee camp in southern Lebanon on Tuesday, killing more than a dozen people. Our Moon Hye-ryan reports.
At least 13 people have been killed in an Israeli airstrike on a city in southern Lebanon. Lebanon's health ministry said Tuesday that 4 others were wounded in the strike, which Israel claims targeted militants at a training compound inside the country's largest Palestinian refugee camp. Palestinian refugees make up a significant community in Lebanon, most of them descendants of families displaced during the 1948 war. Many now live in densely populated camps where groups like Hamas have maintained influence for decades. Eyewitnesses dispute Israel's account.
They struck a civilian area. There's nothing there, just a parking lot. They claim it's a military camp, but there is no camp.
The Israeli military says the compound was being used by Hamas to plan attacks against Israel, a claim Hamas has dismissed as pure fabrication and lies. The group condemned the strike, insisting it has no military facilities in Palestinian camps in Lebanon and that the site was an open sports field. The IDF said it used precision munitions, aerial surveillance and additional intelligence to minimize civilian casualties. Israel currently maintains 5 military posts inside Lebanon and regularly carries out strikes in the country's south, saying they target Hezbollah or at times Hamas operatives. Lebanese officials report that Israeli attacks have killed around 4,000 people, including civilians, and displaced more than 1.2 million residents. Israeli authorities say the hostilities have also killed more than 80 soldiers and 47 civilians on their side. Moon Hye-ryan, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, on the football field here in South Korea, the national team ended the year on Tuesday with a 1-0 win over Ghana. During a friendly at the Seoul World Cup Stadium, defender Lee Tae-seok scored the only goal of the night. Despite the victory, Team Korea's performance was considered lackluster against the 73rd ranked Ghana. The national team is concluding this year with 8 wins, 3 draws and 2 losses. Up next, we revisit the importance of the Gyeongju Declaration at this year's APEC leaders meeting here in South Korea on promoting cultural and creative industries as new growth engines. Our Yoon-jin explains.
The Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, or APEC, has been closely tied to free trade since its inception. It was established to expand trade in the Asia-Pacific region at a time in the early 1990s when other large regional blocs were created, like the European Union and the North American Free Trade Agreement. An export-driven South Korea, accordingly, has played a key role since the early days of APEC.
김영삼 대통령은 APEC이 개방적 국제무역제도 확립에 이바지해야 한다고 역설하는 등 선진국과 개발도상국의 중간 입장에서의 조율 역할을 충실히 수행했습니다.
However, just over 30 years later, the foundation of free trade that underpins APEC has been shaken. Since the second Trump administration, protectionism has gained renewed strength as the U.S. and China compete for global dominance. As Korea has grown into one of the world's top 10 economies under the APEC framework of free trade, the Gyeongju APEC meeting was both a challenge and an opportunity to rekindle the spirit of free trade while also securing new engines of growth. In this context, the key agreement in the Gyeongju Declaration centers on the potential of the cultural and creative industries.
문화 창조 분야에 대한 약간의 논란이 있었지만 그건 쉽게 합의가 됐다고 합니다. 그래서 전체적으로는 모든 회원국들이 뜻을 모아서 우리 아시아 태평양이 그리고 전 세계가 나아갈 길에 대해서 충분히 의미 있는 결론을 만들어냈다고 생각됩니다.
This reflects the government's determination to further support the growth of Hallyu, which of course includes K-pop and K-dramas, not just as popular culture, but as a national growth industry on par with semiconductors. At the same time, the Gyeongju Declaration signifies that leaders across the Asia-Pacific region have recognized the growth potential of the cultural industry. It also highlights the urgent need for cooperation across industries to support the drive in development of Hallyu beyond cosmetics, food, and tourism. 이은진, Arirang News.
This is The World Now, bringing you everything you need to know from around the globe. We begin in the U.S. today. A bill requiring the U.S. Justice Department to release records related to the late convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein has cleared both the House and the Senate, and now moves to President Donald Trump's desk to be signed into law. In the House, the measure passed overwhelmingly with a 427-1 vote, following a month of delay caused by Republican opposition and earlier hesitation from Trump. Trump, however, on Monday said he would sign a bill requiring the Justice Department to release all records on Epstein if it reaches him. The legislation will make public a comprehensive set of documents detailing how federal authorities handle the Epstein case. Previously, over 20,000 pages of documents related to Epstein were released by lawmakers last week. In Chile, at least 5 tourists have died in a snowstorm in the Torres del Paine National Park. 4 others who are missing have been found alive. Authorities are working to recover the bodies of those who died. Chilean President Gabriel Boric expressed condolences and confirmed that police and army teams have been deployed to assist with rescue and recovery efforts, which have been made difficult by heavy snowfall and winds reaching 190 kilometers per hour. Officials said the tourists were hiking without a guide and became lost in a remote area of the park, requiring a 4 to 5 hour trek from the nearest accessible point. Parts of the national park remain closed due to the severe weather. U.S. film star Tom Cruise has received his first Oscar, an honorary statuette, at Hollywood's annual Governor's Award. The 63-year-old actor, known for Top Gun and Mission Impossible, was celebrated alongside Dolly Parton, Debbie Allen, and Wynn Thomas. Cruise paid a tribute to filmmakers and collaborators across his 45-year career, highlighting the power of cinema to connect audiences and inspire imagination. The Academy cited Cruise's dedication to filmmaking, theatrical experiences, and performing his own stunts as reasons for the honor, recognizing his enduring influence on the film industry. 윤세영, Arirang News.
This morning, sub-zero temperatures continued in most parts of the country. It was a bit warmer than yesterday in the middle of the day, but it topped out at below 10 degrees Celsius in most areas and stayed chilly. The cold spell will end tomorrow. The morning temperature will recover back to above 0 degrees with Seoul at 2 degrees Celsius, and the daytime temperature will move up to above 10 degrees, returning to the average temperature for this time of year. There won't be much cold until the weekend. Tomorrow morning, Chuncheon will start cold at -4 degrees, Daegu and Gyeongju at 1 degree. Daily highs will rise up to 13 degrees in Seoul, 15 degrees in Gyeongju and Jeju. Jeju will receive less than 5 millimeters of rain by dawn tomorrow. There will be about 1 centimeter of snow in the mountainous areas of Jeju Island as well. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
Those are the headlines at this hour here in South Korea. Coming up next is our daily panel session.
To set the facts straight. Get Korea right.
안녕하세요. 방크에서 활동하는 박지은 연구원입니다. 한글은 600년의 역사를 가진 우리나라 고유의 문자인데요. 한글에 대해 잘 모르는 분도 많고 또 잘못된 정보를 접한 분도 꽤 있더라고요. 사이버 외교사절을 딴 방크의 일원으로서 제가 한글에 대한 올바른 정보를 전달해 드릴게요. 한글은 조선 4대 왕인 세종대왕이 1443년에 창제한 글자예요. 한글은 자음과 모음으로 구성되어 있는데요. 자음은 입술, 이, 목구멍과 같이 발음 기관의 모양이나 그 움직임을 본떠 만들었고요. 모음은 하늘, 땅, 사람을 본떠 만들었답니다. 한글의 창제 원리와 사용법을 써놓은 훈민정음 해례본은 1962년 대한민국 국보로 지정되었고 1997년 유네스코 세계기록유산으로 등재되었습니다. 창적이고 과학적이며 아름다운 문자인 한글, 한국인의 위대한 문화유산입니다. 한국 바로 알리기. 여러분도 함께 해주세요.
혼자라는 게 때론 지울 수 없는 낙인 같아 살아가는 게 나를 죄인으로 만드네 꽃이 된 사람 꽃이 된 사람 사랑하다가 나도 꽃이 되었네
On Press Perspective today, we touch upon the outlook shared by high-level U.S. military officials on South Korea's potential role in promoting regional security and stability. Hello and welcome. It's Wednesday, November 19th here in Seoul, and you're watching Press Perspective. I'm Min San-hee. South Korea's potential role in regional peace and security has been highlighted by top U.S. military officials in recent days. Now, today we touch upon what has been said and what they mean. For more on this, I have Thomas Maresca with United Press International here in the studio. Thomas, welcome back.
Thanks. Great to be here.
I also have Peter Lee, a research fellow at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Peter, Dr. Lee, it's great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Right, we shall start here in the studio. Thomas, as I mentioned earlier, quite a number of top U.S. military officials in recent days have been highlighting South Korea's potential role in promoting regional stability. Let's start off with the remarks by the Chief of U.S. Naval Operations.
Right, so this was Admiral Daryl Caudle, as you said, the Chief of U.S. Naval Operations, and he's been in South Korea as part of an Asia trip over the past, week, 10 days, and he made some remarks in Seoul on Friday that were basically referencing South Korea's future potential nuclear-powered submarines, and this was right after this fact sheet had come out outlining, the U.S. approval of Seoul being able to build and perhaps source fuel for these nuclear submarines, and so Admiral Caudle basically said that, using these submarines to perhaps counter China would be a natural expectation, was the quote, given the capability that these vessels have. And, he even invoked Spider-Man, the film, with this phrase, with great power comes great responsibility, and was saying pretty much outright that, South Korea would sort of shift away from being a regional navy to a global navy with the power of these subs, and kind of framed it as this responsibility. And so this is representing this shift in how Washington is looking at the U.S.-South Korea alliance. And we've heard there's been many voices talking about this and this kind of sense of alliance modernization, and South Korea taking on both more of its own sort of responsibility at home, as well as perhaps shifting some of its resources and perhaps shifting some of the U.S. troops based here towards more regional objectives or potential threats especially, and Caudle mentioned this as well, regarding China, which the U.S. frequently calls its so-called pacing threat. And so, I think we're seeing some outlines where there's obviously some of this is in both sides' interests. We do know that Seoul has wanted to acquire these nuclear-powered submarines for quite a long time. This is a step for South Korea, generally speaking, to perhaps gain, wartime operational control of its troops, which has also long been a goal. But, at the same time, there is some tension where, South Korea mostly has framed some of these developments as being an eye more towards North Korea, in particular, responding to North Korea's developments. So, and I think Lee Jae-myung has certainly mentioned the threat of China as well. But, I think generally speaking, there seems to be kind of a perspective from some analysts where this is a point where, how far does the push and pull go with Seoul kind of, fully getting on board with Washington's focus on China. And we're already seeing, there's some questions too about where even these vessels are going to be built. There's some kind of, we still don't know all the details about that. And then, we've seen already China has voiced its concerns about these nuclear subs. The Chinese ambassador, said if there is, quote, if there's a change in the strategic purpose of the South Korea-U.S. alliance, China's perspective toward the alliance would also change. So, South Korea has to obviously keep that factor in mind as well. So, this is one of the areas that we're seeing this developing process.
Right. Those concerns by the Chinese ambassador here in South Korea, Dai Bing, coming on last week, of course, just before the release of the fact sheet. Peter, pundits here in South Korea say what perhaps startled them even more than the request for nuclear-powered submarines by the president was his reasoning. Now, the president spoke of restrictions in South Korea's ability, and I'm quoting, to track North Korean and Chinese vessels. What are your thoughts regarding his remarks?
So I think Thomas gave a really good sort of overview of how the two issues, North Korea and China, have fit into this debate. But I think President Lee Jae-myung, he took a calculated gamble in terms of mentioning China as a possible justification for why South Korea should be given access to this nuclear-propelled submarine technology. It's worth recalling that the United States has never shared this other than with the United Kingdom in the 1950s and more recently with Australia as part of the AUKUS partnership. So it's really an unprecedented decision by the United States. And if you think back the last 20 years or so, South Korea has floated the idea of acquiring a nuclear-powered submarine capability under both progressive and conservative governments. And usually that motivation has been about North Korea. And the United States has not found that sufficient or sufficiently compelling to grant that transfer. And so by President Lee Jae-myung mentioning that it's not just about North Korea, it's not just about the Korean Peninsula, but actually it's about South Korea's contributions to the United States and US alliance strategy in the broader region, I think that was far more compelling. And so that was a calculated risk because progressive governments especially, but South Korean governments more broadly, have generally been very reticent about mentioning explicitly China as a strategic target for their military buildup, for their military strategy in the region. And so I think President Lee Jae-myung had made a calculated gamble in that sense.
Right, and hence the response from quite a number of pundits here in the country. Thomas, moving forward, the commander of U.S. Forces Korea has stressed the strategic positioning of South Korea for regional security. Could you tell us more about his observations and their broader implications?
Yeah, so this is, kind of in the same context of some of these other, topics about the alliance that have been floating around. And this was Commander of U.S. Forces Korea, General Xavier Brunson, and he recently had promoted this idea of, they're calling it the East-Up mapping, which is, taking a map and turning, rather than north being the top, turning it and making the east be the top, and, looking at it that way, he is saying that you see that the three American allies in the Indo-Pacific, and he's saying South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines, create a sort of strategic triangle for regional security. And so he's trying to kind of frame this as these alliances shouldn't be seen as, isolated bilateral relationships between Washington and each country, but as kind of the sides of a triangle working together. And, he talked about how each country has equipped with unique capabilities, Korea's central kind of depth, Japan's technological advantage and maritime reach, Philippines' access to these key southern sea lanes. And, he really was focusing kind of on how Korea is in the middle of this. He said that Korea acts as kind of a natural pivot, and he pointed out that Camp Humphreys, where the USFK is based, is around 160 miles, he's using miles, from Pyongyang, 610 miles from Beijing, and 500 miles from Vladivostok. So it's, positioned to address northern threats even from Russia, as well as, providing a Western reach against Chinese activities. And so, this definitely is just a part of this. It's kind of spelling out maybe a bit more this strategic flexibility debate that's been going on, and whether, the 28,500 or so U.S. troops stationed here could possibly be deployed beyond the peninsula, including potentially, the Taiwan contingency has come up as a factor. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was here recently, and he also kind of suggested flexibility for regional contingencies is something that, the two sides would take a look at. And again, I think it's opportunities and risks again for South Korea. It is raising Seoul's strategic importance, beyond just the peninsula. But again, you risk entangling Korea in this deeper kind of, U.S.-China competition, which, Peter sort of spelled out some of the Seoul's perspective on how to navigate this. And I think it's obviously, I would just add that, nowadays, certainly the alliance still seems strong, but, with the Trump administration in particular, focusing on this kind of America First perspective on everything as an overarching kind of position, and, the idea that these relationships are a little bit more transactional than perhaps, they have been in the past. You have to factor that in. I think most allies are also trying to figure out what does that mean for us. And, for South Korea, you can't just kind of ignore China, as a neighbor, as an economic partner, just not only as a sort of military potential, threat, but just obviously as a super important economic partner. So again, it's something that South Korea has a lot of sort of calculating to try and work out.
Right. Peter, I'm going to pick up from where Thomas just left off then. The South Korea joint document, that was the South Korea-US joint document that was disclosed late last week, details, and I'm quoting, the importance of preserving peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, and opposes unilateral changes to the status quo. What would be the ripple effects of a hostile confrontation between China and Taiwan for South Korea, keeping in mind, of course, its alliance with the US, Peter?
So I think it's worth keeping in mind that this is not the first time that Korea and the United States have mentioned peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. So if we go back, the first time that was mentioned in recent years was in 2021 under the progressive Moon Jae-in administration with the Biden administration. And so that language is basically, verbatim. We've seen that reappear over the years, even under conservatives as well. If you think back 2 years ago to the Camp David trilateral with Korea, Japan, and the US, that went even further. And then, for instance, they mentioned peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait as an indispensable element of security and prosperity in the international community. So that's quite robust language. I think more fundamentally, the point is that Korea clearly has a stake in ensuring peace and stability in that conflict. It's not to say that Korea is going to be involved in that conflict, or that Korea wants to escalate or increase tensions, right? It's Korea opposes the use of unilateral force by China. And I think it reflects, part of the submarine discussion that we were having earlier, right? The United States clearly is concerned that the People's Republic of China has taken actions in the last few years and months that really have raised concerns about what it intends to do, and potentially upset the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. And so I think that is the broader context within which Korea and the United States have really put this out there. President Lee Jae-myung mentioning that these submarines would be involved in Taiwan, in tracking Chinese submarines, for instance. I think that's part of the context as well. I think if you look at the joint fact sheet, there are other elements that we see that Korea and the United States are thinking more broadly, right? Taiwan, but also into the broader Indo-Pacific region. And so, for instance, the fact sheet mentions they want to enhance conventional U.S. deterrence posture against all regional threats to the alliance, including North Korea. And so, it's open to interpretation of what all regional threats are. But I think that is the context within which we should see this Taiwan Strait reference. It's not something new. I don't think it's completely escalatory, but I think there are ripple effects. And just going back, Korea is a maritime trading nation. It is not immune for what happens in other parts of the region, whether that's the Taiwan Strait whether that's the South China Sea. Korea has direct national interests and economic interests in these areas where China is clearly escalating tensions. And so I think Korea is saying very clearly that it wants these disputes to be resolved peacefully and through negotiation rather than through the use of force.
Right. Meanwhile, with regard to tensions over Taiwan, Thomas, a related dispute between Japan and China appears to have led to travel warnings and movie postponements. Do tell us about how this diplomat dispute started and where does it stand right now?
Right. So, yeah, this has really been, roiling the news in Japan and around the region. But it basically started when Prime Minister Takaichi told Japan's parliament this was on November 7th, that a Chinese attack on Taiwan would count as a, quote, situation threatening Japan's survival and could trigger a military response from Tokyo. And, this is something that, Japanese leaders have kind of talked around this issue, but the idea of actually explicitly sort of mentioning military intervention is something previous prime ministers have not done, as far as I know. China responded quite vigorously. It really felt like it was bringing back this wolf warrior diplomacy that we've seen in recent years from China, this kind of aggressive rhetoric, and I think South Korea has experienced some of that as well. But, one thing that kicked it off was China's consul general in Osaka tweeted out saying that in response to Takaichi's comments that, the dirty neck that sticks itself in must be cut off, a very violent image, and that kind of triggered some back and forth responses. But, China's a lot of commentary in Chinese state-run media was attacking Japan over this comment. And China issued a travel warning advising its citizens to refrain from visiting Japan. Major Chinese airlines said they were offering refunds and changes on tickets to Japan. And there's just been kind of a constant day by day, little other segments. On Sunday, the Chinese Ministry of Education warned citizens to exercise caution when making plans to study in Japan, citing, a worsening public security situation and warning that there were crimes targeting Chinese nationals. Chinese Ministry of Defense on Friday said that Japan would suffer a crushing defeat if it dared to intervene. As you mentioned, Chinese film distributors suspended the release of a couple of Japanese anime films. And it's kind of basically it's a playbook that we've seen China use elsewhere, including to South Korea to some extent, this economic coercion. And it's sort of, at the moment, it's areas that are not sort of fundamentally it's not a trade war in the sense that China's necessarily could be harmed from it, but it's picking segments that could impact Japan. If it's travelers not going there, it's something 7.5 million travelers from China visited Japan between January and September, which is the highest amount from any country. There's even been more. I think even today, China notified Tokyo of suspension of seafood imports. So, and the Chinese Premier Li Chang said, I guess that he has no plans to meet Takaichi at this week's G20 summit. So they're not backing down at all. At the same time, Takaichi and Tokyo has also sort of played it down, saying it was more theoretical comments. The foreign minister, Motegi, said there's no reason to apologize. So, for Takaichi too, she kind of came to power on this more stridently nationalist, position. So she's not someone who, necessarily would want to seem, to back down. So I think at the moment, it just feels like it's not going anywhere. It's kind of tense. It hasn't been, a major, it's like cut here or cut there. It could have a real impact on Japan. I mean, Japan could feel some of the economic impact of it, but, it hasn't raised to the level of, say, like rare earth export controls, which China sort of pulled out when it was in the trade negotiations with Washington. So there's more cards that China could play if they want to take this to another stage. So, but right now, yeah, it feels like this could last for a while. And it is kind of the return of this aggressive sort of Chinese stance using economic coercion at its disposal.
Right. Peter, do you fear a similar spat perhaps between South Korea and China going forward? I mean, how should South Korea, generally speaking, seek to navigate regional geopolitical tensions, do you think?
I mean, so Thomas mentioned the playbook, right? I mean, and China's been running this playbook for nearly 20 years now, and using economic coercion and threats and wolf warrior diplomacy to really intimidate any country that is seen as encroaching on China's interests. The irony is that it's backfired spectacularly over the last 20 years, right? There are very few countries that have, after experiencing coercion, been more supplicant to China. And so, South Korea's own case, since the 2016-2017, THAAD missile defense deployment, Korea has been on the receiving end of Chinese economic coercion for the better part of almost a decade now. And, only recently, even at the APEC summit, the last of the Chinese, sanctions and coercion were being lifted. So it's been almost a decade. Now, has that changed South Korea's thinking or logic? I don't think so. So in that sense, China's approach to try to intimidate these countries, for even slight, mishaps, I think has not really been very effective. As for how this affects South Korea, I think, the nature of the relationship with China has changed significantly over that decade since the THAAD crisis. And so South Korea is, I think, far more resilient against potential Chinese coercion in the same way that they would try to do what they're doing against Japan right now. But South Korea's economic relations, and even President Lee Jae-myung, when he was in Washington in August, he mentioned very clearly in a think tank conference that the old logic doesn't apply of Korea seeking security with the United States and economic prosperity with China. And I think the trade flows, the decoupling, the de-risking that has taken place in that time means that Korea has far more immunity from potential Chinese efforts to coerce South Korea.
Right, and in the meantime, South Korea, Thomas, has proposed military talks with North Korea. Could you give us some context behind this proposal, and what are the chances of such cross-border communication, do you think?
Right, so this was on Monday. South Korea's Deputy Defense Minister Kim Hong-chol officially proposed military talks with North Korea to clarify the military demarcation line and in an effort to prevent accidental armed conflict. And this is basically in the context of South Korea's military several times, this year and in recent years has fired warning shots to repel, North Korean troops that have violated the border, the military demarcation line kind of within the DMZ, pretty much since North Korea started to go back to that area, and they've been doing a lot of work there, rebuilding fences, putting guard posts back up. And so there's been a number of times when they've crossed into South Korean territory, and the South has fired warning shots and sort of warned them to run back. And I think the defense minister said there was about 10 times this year alone this has already happened, and including there was an incident where North Korean soldiers crossed over while chasing a defector. But Seoul basically, and has said this usually in each time they've fired these warning shots that it seems accidental for the most part where the North Koreans are crossing over, and there is this sense of both sides don't know exactly where the border really is. A lot of these military demarcation line posts that were put up at the end of the Korean War are not there anymore, so they're just hard to know where. So basically they're, it's a sensible kind of thing to reach out, but I think the chances of there being a response from North Korea seem quite slim. I mean, they haven't responded to anything that the South has attempted as far as restarting inter-Korean dialogue, as much as President Lee Jae-myung has made that a goal. For now, it doesn't seem like there's any kind of particular reason to expect them to respond, but it's another thing out there on the table. And, with the sort of Trump factor floating around where maybe we'll see a summit between, Trump and Kim Jong-un, this, could perhaps sort of work its way into that context. But yeah, that's where it is, I think. Now.
Right. There's been a bit of talk about a potential talk between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, perhaps next year in China when China hosts the APEC meeting, of course. All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Thomas, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
And Peter, Dr. Lee, over at Asan Institute for Policy Studies, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thanks for having me, Sunny.
Right, and that is all the time we have for this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching.